The boarding gate was noisy, but the sound that cut through it all was a sharp, clipped voice. A young boy stood in the middle of the jet bridge, his backpack hanging low, both hands gripping a first-class ticket like it was the only thing keeping him steady. The flight attendant leaned down, her polished smile tight, her tone cold enough to freeze him in place. Gasps rippled from the line behind us, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. His lips moved, trying to explain. She shook her head, blocking his way with one arm. People exchanged uneasy glances. A man behind me muttered, "She's not letting him on." The boy's shoulders drew in, his eyes darting to the cabin beyond her, the seat he was supposed to be in. I won't tell you yet what her words were. I will tell you this. They set off a chain of events so fast, so irreversible, that before the wheels touched the runway at our destination, her career, her reputation, and something far bigger were already in free fall. If you believe these stories need to be told, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ and tell me in the comments the country you're watching from. I read them all. Because in that moment, no one at the gate could have guessed who that boy really was, or how, in less than a day, the balance of power on this airline would flip. Hours before that tense moment at the jet bridge, I'd noticed him in the boarding area. He sat quietly off to the side, legs too short to touch the floor, swinging gently in the air. No phone in his hand, no loud chatter, just a small, hardback book balanced on his lap. His pressed blazer was a shade too big, but it made him look older, more official, like he belonged in a room full of decision-makers. On the table beside him lay a sleek black carry-on and a first-class ticket tucked neatly under the book's cover. He didn't fidget or tap his foot the way most kids would before a trip. Instead, he watched the departure screens with a calm focus that made me curious. His father arrived a few minutes later. No entourage, no flash, just a well-fitted navy suit, worn with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything. The kind of man who could own half the terminal and still carry his own briefcase. I'd overheard enough to know he wasn't just another business traveler. The whispers were hard to miss. That's the majority shareholder, the airline's senior partner in a long-standing family investment. And yet his interaction with his son wasn't about wealth or influence. He crouched down to eye level, speaking softly. I caught fragments about confidence, knowing your worth, and walking into any room like you're meant to be there. This flight wasn't about luxury. It was about principle. His son was traveling in first class because he'd earned the right to be there, just as much as anyone else on that plane. They didn't flaunt their connection to the airline. If anything, his father seemed intent on his son experiencing travel as any other paying customer, to see how the world treated him without a name tag or title to shield him. The boy nodded earnestly, straightening his posture in the oversized blazer. When boarding was announced, his father handed him the ticket and smiled. Not the proud, showy smile of a man sending his child into the spotlight, but the kind of smile that carried trust. Trust that the world would see him for who he was. He couldn't have known that. Just minutes later, that trust would be shattered, not by a stranger's ignorance, but by something far uglier. And I was about to witness the exact moment it happened. When boarding was called, the gate area shifted into that familiar scramble. The beeps of scanners, the hum of rolling luggage, voices layered over the crackle of the PA system. The first-class line was short, a mix of sharp suits, designer carry-ons, and the occasional weary business traveler clutching a coffee like a lifeline. The boy stepped into the line with quiet confidence, ticket in one hand, carry-on in the other. His father stood a few spots back, making small talk with another passenger. At the jet bridge entrance, the flight attendant, tall, uniform, immaculate, smiled just a bit too tight, took the boy's ticket. Her eyes scanned it, then flicked up to him with a look that drained the air out of the space between them. "This is a first-class ticket," she said flatly. "Who gave this to you?" The boy blinked, as if trying to process why the question was even being asked. "My dad," he began, but she cut him off. "Step to the side." Her hand, open and firm, guided him toward the wall of the jet bridge. The next passenger's boarding pass beeped, and she waved them through without pause. I felt the shift immediately. The way conversations softened around us, eyes darted, a few brows furrowed. Not everyone noticed, but those who did were already uncomfortable. He tried again, his voice quieter this time. "It's my seat. My ticket says—" "First class isn't in your section," she interrupted, leaning in as if to keep her words private, but with a tone sharp enough for the people nearby to hear. "Economy is further down. That's where you'll need to go." Her body moved just enough to block his view of the cabin door. She wasn't raising her voice, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. You don't belong here. A man behind me muttered something under his breath. Another passenger, a woman in a business suit, tilted her head and frowned. The boy's grip on his ticket tightened until the paper bent. From my place in line, I caught his father watching. Still calm, but his eyes locked on the scene, jaw set. He didn't rush forward. He didn't announce who he was. He simply observed, as if letting the moment reveal itself in full. I wanted to speak, to cut in and say what everyone with a shred of sense could see, that this was wrong, plain and simple. But I held back, my anger simmering beneath the surface. The truth was, I wanted to hear every word she thought she could get away with saying to him. I wanted her prejudice to stand bare in front of witnesses. And as more passengers filed past, the boy remained pinned in place, held there not by any airline policy, but by the small wall of authority she was building with her stance and her tone. What she didn't know, what almost no one in that jet bridge knew, was that her actions in this moment weren't just about to cost her a seat in good standing with her employer. They were about to shake the very foundation of the company she worked for. By the time the boy was finally waved through, the shine in his expression had dulled. His steps, once steady, had a hesitance to them, like he was walking into a room where he already knew he wasn't welcome. A few rows back, his father joined the boarding line. He moved without fanfare, blending in as though he were just another traveler. But when his eyes found his son ahead in the aisle, shoulders slightly hunched, something in his face changed. The softness gone, replaced by a watchful stillness. He didn't rush forward. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he took his seat a few rows behind first class, in clear view of the galley where the flight attendant was standing. She glanced at him briefly, unaware of who he was, then returned to shuffling papers and adjusting the service cart. Moments later, the boy approached his assigned seat in the first row of first class. She stepped toward him, blocking the space once more. "You'll need to sit in the section you're assigned to," she said, her tone sharper than before. He pointed to his ticket again, the bent edges now evidence of the grip he'd kept on it since the gate. "This is my seat," he said softly. Her lips pressed together. "For security reasons, I'm going to ask you to wait in the galley until this is sorted." That word, security, was like a match dropped in dry grass. Several passengers nearby exchanged looks. One man pulled out his phone, angling it toward them. A woman in the second row raised her eyebrows and muttered, "Seriously?" under her breath. From behind, the father stood and walked forward. The aisle seemed to clear on its own. He stopped just short of them, voice even but carrying enough weight that every ear nearby caught it. "This is my son," he said. "That is his seat. And we'll discuss what just happened after the flight, with your supervisor." The attendant's face tightened, part surprise, part discomfort, but she stepped aside. "Of course, sir," she said, the words polite but edged. The boy slid into his seat, gaze fixed out the window, his earlier excitement nowhere to be found. I could see his reflection in the glass. Jaw clenched, blinking more than usual. Phones were still out. A low current of conversation moved through the cabin as people settled in, some pretending to ignore what they'd witnessed, others too angry to hide it. The father returned to his seat, posture relaxed, but there was no mistaking the quiet tension in his stillness. He wasn't letting this go. Not now. Not when the whole cabin had seen his son treated like a trespasser in a space he had every right to occupy. And though the flight hadn't even left the ground, the real journey, the one that would decide far more than a seat assignment, had already begun. The engines roared and the cabin tilted upward, but the mood on board didn't lift with it. Even at cruising altitude, there was a weight in the air that had nothing to do with turbulence. Conversations stayed low, broken up by long silences. I caught fragments, unbelievable, from somewhere behind me, and probably a misunderstanding, from a man in business class who clearly wanted the matter brushed aside. The boy kept to himself, staring out the window as clouds slid past in slow motion. His father, a few rows back, had a small notepad open on his tray table. He scribbled something, then slipped an earpiece in and began making calls, voice measured, every word chosen with care. But there was no mistaking the intent. I couldn't hear the full conversations, but certain phrases carried just enough to reach me. Flag the board, bring legal in, set a meeting before market opens. There was no raised tone, no outburst, just a steady current of authority moving beneath the calm. Each call ended with the same quiet finality. I'll see you when we land. As the hum of the engines filled the cabin, my mind drifted back to something I'd heard about him before. Whispers in the travel industry about a man who had saved this airline from collapse years ago. Back then, a mismanaged merger had bled it nearly dry, and it was his investment, his networks, and his insistence on certain ethical reforms that kept the airline's name alive. He hadn't taken over the company. He'd taken a majority stake quietly, avoiding headlines, and kept the focus on building routes, restoring passenger trust, and, most importantly, setting a tone of fairness in customer treatment. That wasn't just branding for him. It was personal. His own father had been denied a seat on a domestic flight decades earlier, long before smartphones could capture such moments. The humiliation had stayed with the family, shaping his belief that equality in travel wasn't optional. It was the baseline. Now here he was, watching his son experience the very thing he'd spent years working to prevent. And from the steady way he tapped the corner of that notepad with his pen, I knew this wasn't going to be filed away as a minor complaint. The flight attendant passed through the aisle more than once, her expression professionally neutral, perhaps sensing the unease, but not realizing its source. She offered drinks in first class with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Every time she glanced toward the boy's row, he kept his gaze locked on the clouds. What she didn't know was that while she was pouring coffee and tucking away meal trays, senior management had already been pinged. By the time we crossed state lines, at least 3 members of the airline's executive team were aware of an incident in first class, and not from her version of events. The messages going out were from the owner's phone, and they weren't asking for clarification. They were setting expectations. PR teams were being looped in mid-flight, legal counsel briefed, and a small high-level meeting scheduled to take place immediately after landing. The gears of consequence were turning, fast, quiet, and irreversible. And still, the woman at the center of it all moved up and down the aisle, completely unaware that the man who had been watching her since the jet bridge wasn't just another passenger. He was the one person in the world with the power to decide whether her badge would still open the crew door by the end of the week. The seatbelt light flicked on as we descended, but no one was thinking about tray tables or seatbacks. The tension that had been simmering for the entire flight seemed to thicken as the runway came into view. The boy remained silent, his head turned toward the window, while his father sat still, one hand resting on the closed notepad in front of him. When we taxied to the gate, the usual shuffle to the aisle didn't happen right away. Instead, a small group of men and women in tailored suits stepped into the jet bridge. They weren't gate agents. They weren't ground crew. These were senior officials, the kind whose presence in a boarding area meant something had gone very, very wrong. The father stood and placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder before motioning for him to wait in his seat. As he stepped into the aisle, one of the officials approached, leaning in with a respectful greeting. No handshakes, no introductions needed. I stayed in my seat but angled myself just enough to see into the galley where the flight attendant had been called over. At first, her expression was firm, the kind of guarded confidence that says, "I followed procedure." But as the father's words reached her, something in her posture shifted. Her chin dipped slightly, her eyes breaking contact for the first time. The conversation wasn't loud, but the silence around it made every word feel amplified. "You stopped a passenger from taking the seat he paid for," he said evenly, "because you decided he didn't belong there. That's not security, that's bias." She started to respond, but he continued, his voice steady but unyielding. "Do you know who I am?" He didn't wait for an answer. I own a majority share of this airline. I've invested years into building its reputation, not just for safety, but for respect." One of the executives behind him nodded, their folded arms saying everything about the seriousness of the moment. "This isn't about my son," he went on. "It's about every passenger who's been made to feel small, unwanted, or out of place in a seat they had every right to occupy. When you do that, you don't just hurt a person. You damage the brand, the trust, and the future of the company you represent." Her face had lost all traces of defiance now. She swallowed hard, eyes darting to the executives flanking the father, then back to him. He stepped just a fraction closer, lowering his voice so only those nearest could hear, though I still caught the words. "You didn't just turn away a boy," he said. "You turned away the airline's future." The line landed heavy, and no one moved for a moment. Then the father stepped back, signaling that the discussion, for now, was over. But the look in her eyes told me she already knew her career had just shifted from cruising altitude into a sharp descent. The moment the father stepped off the jet bridge, the conversation moved from quiet confrontation to full-scale escalation. Senior staff escorted him and his son into a private lounge, while the flight attendant was led elsewhere. By the time I exited the aircraft, word had already started to circulate among ground employees. There had been an incident involving a VIP passenger. Inside the airline's operations hub, the news traveled faster than the rolling suitcases on the concourse. Staff group chats lit up, and whispers passed between crew members scheduled for upcoming flights. This wasn't just another passenger complaint. This was about the owner's son. And it was about race, a fact no one could ignore once the details came out. Within an hour, clips from passenger phone recordings began hitting the internet. A shaky but clear video showed the boy standing at the jet bridge entrance, clutching his ticket, while the flight attendant blocked his path. Her voice could be heard saying, "Economy is further down." The boy's quiet insistence that the seat was his made the contrast sting even more. Social media lit up. Hashtags emerged and spread, first among aviation enthusiasts who recognized the father, then across a much broader audience. Comment threads swelled with outrage, personal accounts of similar experiences, and demands for the airline to explain itself. By the end of the day, major news outlets were running the footage alongside headlines that left no room for misinterpretation. Owner's son blocked from first class in apparent racial profiling incident. Cable news panels dissected the video frame by frame. In the markets, the impact showed up almost immediately. The airline stock dipped just under 2%, not catastrophic, but enough to catch the attention of investors. Major shareholders began asking urgent questions, not about routes or fuel prices, but about bias, customer treatment, and brand integrity. Several called for an emergency meeting. I remember thinking how quickly it all unraveled. A moment that could have been avoided with simple decency was now threatening to cost millions. The father, for his part, didn't release an angry statement to the press. He didn't post a shaky, self-filmed reaction online. His moves were quieter, but far more permanent. He met with the airline's executive team that same evening. The agenda wasn't negotiable. First, there would be a full-scale policy review. Not a cosmetic rewrite, but a ground-up overhaul of how passengers were approached, spoken to, and treated, from the moment they stepped into the terminal to the moment they left the aircraft. Second, every member of customer-facing staff, from gate agents to first-class cabin crew, would undergo mandatory anti-bias training. Not a one-off seminar, but ongoing sessions with measurable accountability. Third, incidents involving alleged discrimination would no longer be buried in vague security concern reports. They would be logged, reviewed by a diversity and equity panel, and tracked for patterns. And fourth, perhaps most impactful, supervisors and senior crew would be held personally accountable for the actions of the staff they oversaw. If a member of your team engaged in discrimination, you would answer for it. For many inside the company, it was a wake-up call. Crew members who had long brushed off subtle slights towards certain passengers suddenly realized there would now be a paper trail and consequences. Others, especially those who had witnessed or experienced discrimination themselves, felt a renewed sense of trust in the company's leadership. As for the flight attendant at the center of it all, her her future with the airline became uncertain. She was placed on leave pending investigation, but the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Sitting at home that evening, I thought about how often moments like this happen without an audience, without a phone camera, without someone in the wings who has the power to demand change. The truth is, racism in service industries isn't just immoral, it's expensive. It erodes trust, drives customers away, and in a world where every moment can be broadcast to millions in seconds, it can tear at the reputation of a brand built over decades. This time, the boy had someone in his corner who could move entire boardrooms into action. But for every story like his, there are hundreds that don't make headlines. And that's why this mattered. Not just for one flight, but for every passenger who would board an aircraft after this day, expecting to be treated like they belong. Within 48 hours, the airline's leadership went public, not with the usual corporate phrasing about regrettable misunderstandings or customer service concerns, but with something far rarer in this industry, a direct, unambiguous apology. The president of the airline appeared in a short but widely shared video. His words were measured, but the accountability was clear. Our treatment of this young passenger was unacceptable. We are sorry to him, to his family, and to every traveler who expects dignity when they fly with us. It wasn't just lip service. Alongside the statement came a list of immediate changes, the very reforms the father had outlined in that post-flight meeting. Mandatory anti-bias training, new oversight committees, transparent reporting for discrimination complaints. And though they avoided naming her directly, it was confirmed the flight attendant had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal investigation. For some, that felt like justice. For others, it was only the beginning. The father didn't bask in the attention. He didn't sit for morning show interviews or post fiery commentaries. Instead, he put his focus where it mattered to him most, on turning the moment into something bigger than one family's victory. At a press conference a week later, he announced the creation of a new initiative, the Youth Travel Equity Foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful, to ensure that children, regardless of race or background, could travel without fear of discrimination. The foundation would fund advocacy, training programs for airline and hospitality workers, and scholarships for young people interested in careers in aviation. Standing beside him at the launch was the boy, now dressed in the same blazer from that flight. But this time, his posture was different. His shoulders were square. His eyes met the cameras without hesitation. The confidence his father had wanted him to carry on to that first flight was back. And this time, it was forged in something stronger than comfort. I kept thinking about the contrast between the boy at the gate, clutching that ticket like a lifeline, and the boy now holding his head high in front of an audience that was listening. In the space of days, what had begun as an act meant to humiliate him had instead given him a platform. The return flight, weeks later, was almost symbolic. The father and son boarded together, the boy leading the way down the jet bridge. This time, no one questioned his ticket. No one blocked his path. He settled into his seat and, just before buckling his belt, glanced back at his father with the faintest smile. A small gesture, but one that spoke louder than words. I've seen plenty of incidents where public outrage flares hot and fades fast, leaving nothing but bitterness behind. This wasn't one of them. This was different because it didn't stop at outrage. It moved to action. A personal wrong had been pulled into the light, examined for what it was, and met with the kind of systemic change that might prevent the next child from facing the same question. Who gave this to you? And as the plane's wheels left the ground that day, I found myself watching the boy more than the view outside. His smile wasn't wide or boastful, just calm, steady, and sure. The kind of smile that comes when you've been told you don't belong, and you've proven, without a doubt, that you do. She thought she was keeping him out of first class. She didn't know he owned the whole sky. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one boy or one seat. It was about a truth every parent knows in their bones, that dignity is not a luxury, and you fight for it every time someone tries to take it from your child. Some parents fight quietly behind closed doors. Others stand in the spotlight and challenge the world to do better. but the heart of it is the same. We are the first and last line of defense for the ones we love. I've replayed that day in my mind. The boy's small hands gripping his ticket, the father's stillness as he watched, and the moment the balance shifted, not through shouting or chaos, but through unwavering authority. That's what makes change stick. Because sometimes the fight isn't about raising your voice. Sometimes it's about refusing to step aside when someone tries to shrink you. And in this case, it was about making sure no other child would have to answer for the seat they were already entitled to sit in. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been told you didn't belong somewhere? Has someone ever tried to move you out of a place you'd earned, simply because of who you are? If so, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments and tell me the country you're watching from. These stories matter and they deserve to be heard. And if you believe respect should never depend on skin color, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Because here we remember. Every voice counts, every story has weight, and every seat belongs to the person who earned it.